Assalamu alaikum. Hello and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. In this program, we're going to be looking again at the origins of Western culture. This is part two of a program looking at origins of Western culture. And in today's program, I'm joined by Amjad Hussain Saab from Leeds. Welcome, Amjad.
Thank you.
And I'm joined by Arif Ahmad Saab as well from Spen Valley, West Yorkshire. Arif, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Iqbal.
In the last program, we looked at the origins of Western culture, how really Greece imported much of the Middle Eastern culture and how they developed and shaped it. And it was an incredible culture. They left an amazing legacy behind when you look at major events like the Olympics, which we all love to see. That was from the Greeks, much of the sort of war arts as well. And in terms of our philosophies and mythology from Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. But probably the greatest contribution was through their philosophers and thinkers, people like Socrates and Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, and many others. And we still have books really referring to them, what they taught, what they said, etc. But alongside these great thinkers, they produced some great generals and conquerors, and probably the greatest was Alexander the Great. And we touched on that. His empire stretched from the coasts of the Mediterranean around sort of Rome down to what we know as Tunisia, Libya, across the Indus subcontinent, all of Persia. So Amjad, I'd like you to just take us from there. He was an amazing character, wasn't he, Alexander?
No, absolutely. I think he was really inspired by the philosophers and his own dad, King Philip of Macedonia. And just to mention, the Greeks gave us, of course, the philosophers, the warriors, but also the writers and the poets. You mentioned Homer, but there's another guy by the name of Hesiod who lived at the same time of Homer, around 750 to 650 BC, and he's the one who gives us the theophany, the genealogy of the gods in his works and days, and that's where we get most of the stories of the gods. And Uranus as the father, sky god, he is the son and the husband of Gaia, and all the Greek gods are descendants from these original parents, the first generation of Titans. So these are the ancestors of the Greek gods, and we find this in the works of Theogony. Theogony is the work.
I mean, interesting you mentioned that, because one of the things that people like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle tried to do is counteract all this mythology and all these gods, didn't they? They tried to rationalize theology and faith as well, and some liked it and many others didn't, did they?
Yeah, that goes on to this day, actually, because people are still trying to rationalize these various gods and so on. And we gather that the Romans also adopted the same theme. For instance, Uranus is the sky god, and the Roman equivalent is the Saturn. Saturn is the god, and hence we have the Saturnalia, which is the winter solstice, which has been celebrated, and now we have a Christmas. So it's basically a pagan festival that has been assimilated into modern day Christianity.
We're going to come to the Romans later on, but going back to Alexander, then take us through. You mentioned in the last program how he had gone sort of along the Indus, and he was challenged by the Indians, and really that's when he started turning back. His empire's extent had reached its limits. So take us through what happened as he stopped expanding the empire.
Well, having decimated the Persian Empire and burning down Persepolis, the present-day Pars, as known, we call it in the Persian language, his empire extended all the way to the Indus. And then I think he came across very fierce warriors of the Malis of Multan, where he was fatally wounded, and he was carted back to Babylon, where he died, and then his demise was taken over to Alexandria, present-day Alexandria, where he's buried. And archaeologists are still searching for his tomb, but it remains rather elusive. Arif, is lost to antiquity. But he was a great man, great general, no doubt. At very young age, he achieved what Cyrus the Great tried to achieve in his lifetime. The main thing is that Alexander's victory, he had noble generals, but also the noble thing about him is that despite burning Persepolis in a rage of orgy and drunkenness, he did try to assimilate most of the Persian armies to his side. He was a new kid on the block, and the Persian king had been, mutilated, and I think he subsequently died. So, it was better to be on the side of the victor than on the side of the vanquished. So I think he used the network of the Persian Empire to his advantage. But of course, after his death, his kingdom, his empire was divided among his generals. The North African was taken over by the Ptolemies. And much of the Persian Empire reverted back to what it was. And the Indian legacy was taken over by Chandragupta Maurya. And however, his greatest legacy remained in the heartland, which is basically of the Greco-Roman culture, which is around Greek and Athens. And Athens, as you know, during the classic period of the gods, gave us the temple at Delphi, the oracle at Delphi, the Acropolis, and so on, the Olympic Games, and like you mentioned, the philosophers. So Greek has, but let's not forget, it's a very, it was. There's not a unique culture because obviously it inherits much from the ancient Phoenicians. The early Mycenaean culture, which is the Proto-Greek culture, that has lost to history and its writings. So basically, the Greeks adopted what we call the Proto-Canaanite alphabet with the present Greek alphabet, which obviously now most of the Russian language and Western European script, Latin, Greek text, has its roots in the Proto-Canaanite alphabet. And that, of course, is, we all know, is a Semitic language. So basically the roots of Indo-European languages also have its roots in Semitic languages. So it's very interesting indeed.
Arif, I want to move to yourself. Obviously, the Greek legacy is covered by virtually every history book, and when you go to the libraries, you get so much written about it. But the other empire that had a major impact on Western culture in shaping it was the Roman Empire. And again, there's some very colourful mythology about Rome and its origins, isn't it? Romulus is associated with foundations of Rome. I think 753 BC is the period roughly. And it says that, he was suckled by a she-wolf. As I say, very colourful mythologies about the originators of these great empires. But obviously it was in the shadow of the Greeks and it built up slowly and steadily. So take us through some of the moments really in terms of building up.
Yes, of course. There was, the ancient Roman Empire, as you mentioned, around 750 BC. But it was really around the 2nd century BC where Rome and the Roman Empire came into its own. As with any empire, eventually it comes to an end, whether it's through the death of a great leader like Alexander the Great who can help bring people together. But around the middle of the 2nd century BC, the Roman Empire became the dominant empire. They took over and they defeated the Greeks. And hence, from there on, started the legacy of the emperors that most of us will have heard of: Julius Caesar, Tiberius, Augustus, all of these emperors which people may have heard of. But their purpose was obviously to strengthen the empire. Their purpose was obviously to try and make good governance, to bring some order into society. But of course, at that time, coincidentally, two things were really happening, which we probably all have some understanding or some knowledge about. One was obviously the Jewish culture, the Jewish people in Rome, who had been subjugated for a long time, were waiting for a great military leader to come and lead them out of this subjugation. Whether this was through prophecy or through legend, and we know that, of course, it was the prophet Jesus who came at that time. This obviously disappointed the Jews because, as I said, they were expecting a great military leader, somebody like an Alexander the Great, who would help defeat the Romans. All empires obviously are built upon some military force, and the Romans were no different. They had vast armies, and they used these obviously to subjugate, to punish people, to maintain law and order, as well as to invade neighbouring countries. And also around the same time, the Romans were actually in Britain. It was around about 50 BC before the Romans actually made their first incursions into the UK. And we see those legacies today. I remember in school reading about the Romans and how they built very long, straight roads, didn't have any trees on those roads so that they could march between their cities. And we're lucky in this part of the world that we see the Roman architecture and the Roman influence even to this day in places like York, for example, Lincoln, which are not far from here. But going back to the heart of the Roman Empire, of course, when Prophet Jesus was not the military leader that the Jewish people were expecting, obviously they turned on him. They did not accept him. They did not accept his teaching, which of course was a very peaceful, a very humble, a very meek teaching. That was not what the Jewish people were expecting or what they wanted at that time. So they were obviously very disappointed. Now, the Roman people as well, they also thought that this was causing disorder and disruption. And through the history, you see what happened to Prophet Jesus. The Romans tried to stop him. They eventually arrested him. And crucified him.
I'm going to touch on Jesus' position within the Roman Empire and the sort of the Jewish culture. But before I do that, I just wanted to touch on a little bit in terms of the rise of Rome, really, and why they treated Jesus in this way, and other cultures as well. And you mentioned they were in Britain. So in a sense, for us sitting here in Britain, it's a very important part of our history, isn't it, of how we link back to Roman sort of culture in terms of when they spend the time here, and how they related to Jesus, you know, the sort of founding father from a Christian point of view, of Christianity, and from Islam point of view, such an important prophet. But as the Romans were building their power base up, they were one of many empires. It's always been in the Mediterranean. And I just wanted to ask Amjad to sort of touch on their competition in particular with Carthage, because before their empire expanded and they dominated, they actually had rivals in the Mediterranean, including the Greeks, but also Carthage and more so. And the battle between Carthage and Rome is one of the classical battles, isn't it?
No, absolutely. There's always been competing empires in the Mediterranean, and basically the more maritime powers. Remember, Greek was also a maritime power, and towards the decline of the Greek civilization, its empire was split into three, and towards around 30 BC or 27 BC, Octavian founded the Roman Empire at the back of the remains of the Hellenic culture, but let's not forget the Greek, the North Africans had their own unique culture around Carthage, and of course they were a great maritime power, and it was Rome that basically regarded Carthage as a threat, and I think when the Romans seized one of their warships that was run aground, the Carthaginians declared kind of war. They said, "We want our ship back. Give us the ship, or we'll just come and sort you out." And we hear these famous Punic Wars.
That's right, yeah.
A series of wars fought between Carthage and Rome, and the famous general being Hannibal, of course, and he's a legend in his own right. Having marched over the Alps with Indian war elephants. So can you imagine, he got in war elephants thousands of miles away from India. He recruited these fierce warriors from sub-Saharan Africa, and again, he had an army which was multicultural, pluralist army, and he was a great commander. And he could have.
I mean, he's regarded as one of the greatest commanders in
military
history,
thinkers.
Military thinkers.
Oh yeah,
but just take us through, because he set off from Carthage, which is the sort of old Tunisia, Libya area, over the top of North Africa through Spain.
Of course, Gibraltar.
And then he went through with all his army and
all his army through the Iberian Peninsula,
because
obviously he wanted to use the back door to Rome. But of course, you have the mountains in the way. But he managed to find passes through the mountains, and he marched his elephant over the mountains. Amazing individual, and he found, of course. took on the Roman army, encircled it, hacked it off, and then when all the roads to Rome lay bare open, he did not, finish it off. He did not, use his victory to his advantage, and he left Rome intact. He could have walked into Rome, and that would have been the end of Roman civilization. But thanks to Hannibal, Rome remained intact, and he was one of the surviving generals. Scipio ultimately, he took the war back to Carthage again. Several years later, he managed to get his armies organized, and that's when Hannibal was defeated.
Apparently, when the Romans went to Carthage, they absolutely decimated it.
Oh, they laid it to waste. Yeah, they completely laid it to waste to make sure that there's no resurrection whatsoever, and no, hostilities can ever come from that part of the world. So basically, Carthage, Tunisia, present-day Libya, North Africa became a Roman dominion, and of course. Then they came over to Britain, Julius Caesar, as Arif has mentioned, and York being the centre, southern England, all the way up to Hadrian's Wall. And again, basically, they copied the same format as Alexander and the previous conquerors. A multi-metropolis, cosmopolitan culture at the center of Rome. All, of course, hence the phrase "all the road lead to Rome."
All roads lead to Rome.
And they assimilated a lot of culture, but again, it was a dominant military power. They had the Senate, and of course, they gave us the Colosseum and the gladiators.
I mean, this is Arif, the other bit, isn't it? Quite a lot of people portray the Romans as quite ruthless and barbaric, and that they're brilliant military campaigners, brilliant architects, and leaving landmarks, but they enjoyed their sport, and blood sport in particular.
Of course, when you watch films, the great films that have been on, you see chariot races, you see gladiators, you see these big colosseums, and you think that the Romans were just basically killing people for entertainment. That's the sort of the thing that sort of comes out. But of course, there was another side to them: the cultural side, the architectural side, the governance side. But of course, the Colosseums and these games were obviously used again to subjugate people, whether it was slaves or whether it was to punish people. They were doing it in such a way that it was, at the same time as being public entertainment, it was also setting an example. The Romans are maybe unfairly famous for crucifixion. This was a punishment that was had been around for many years. And of course, we know that Prophet Jesus was crucified. But it was not a punishment that was unique to the Romans, but it was done as not so much as a way of killing people, but as a way of prolonging their agony. They would obviously nail through people's wrists and nail through people's feet, and they would be hanging on a cross maybe for 2 days. And it was often more just the thirst and the hunger that killed people. But again, I presume that this was done in a way that, because it was very public, people could see that if they misbehave, this is how they might end up, and this would obviously act as a big deterrent to stop, misbehaving or to lead to rebellion in any way. As I was saying earlier, obviously the Jews had been subjugated. They were waiting for this military leader. When Prophet Jesus turned out not to be the military leader and they rebelled, the Romans very swiftly and severely put that down, burned the temple that the Jews prayed at, and then scattered them to the far corners of the empire. I mean, at that time, the Roman Empire was very big. I believe it had about 70 million people and covered about 20% of the world's population. If you can imagine in today's term that there was an empire that controlled 1/5 of the term of the population, you could see all of these different cultures. As Amjad mentioned, it was difficult to keep this sort of people in control.
But I suppose this is the classic challenge all empires face, isn't it? Rebellions on the sort of periphery and outside the sort of main homeland, and also discontentment at home as well. And Rome was trying to find that balance as well, because when you look at Julius Caesar, who was such an interesting figure. And one of the reasons why he marched back was because he was getting fed up with what he was hearing, what was going on in Rome. You had, rebellions outside, but also the Senate was misbehaving. And so to take us, because I know he met a very interesting end, but just take us through this.
This the irony of things. I mean, as all great empires, there's a rise, there's a peak, and then there's a fall. You have good military generals who are tactical, wise to a degree, and of course they try to keep the people on their side to a degree, maybe fighting rebellion here and there, but the main emphasis is on assimilating people, having a control. Don't get me wrong, no emperor likes a rebellion on their hand, but then you get despotic leaders like Nero, Caligula, who went on a rampage, and so on, and so you get the good, the bad, and ugly of all empires, and unfortunately, as things rise, things also have to fall.
Arif, you mentioned the name of Julius Caesar, who was probably one of the most interesting characters in the Roman world. A highly successful general, and I think he was sort of creating trouble for the English in England, and empire stretched across the Middle East as well. But there came a stage where I think he genuinely got fed up with all the shenanigans going on in Rome between the Senate and the politicians and everything. So take us through what happened next.
Of course, leaders and military people and emperors, they like to lead and they don't like interference. So I think Julius Caesar, as many people probably know, decided that he knew how to make the decisions himself. And effectively came back to Rome and sort of started to rule almost like a dictator. Many people will see Julius Caesar as a sort of a dictator. But there were also things which he introduced, reforms. So, for example, the Julian calendar, that's a calendar that we still use today. There is still a month of the year that's named after him. And although he had a very tight control on what was going on in Rome, he still knew how to maintain politics. So, for example, the Romans still maintained a good relationship with the Egyptians. Cleopatra, the ruler in Egypt at that time, had good relations with Rome at that time. And it was only after years of oppression and years of being a dictator that eventually Julius Caesar was killed in a plot by Brutus. But it was a long-standing legacy that rulers after that thought that, maybe being a dictator was the way to go. Maybe, that was the way to have a better control over society rather than trying to get other people involved and using the Senate, that if you just had an absolute say, you were able to do things quicker and get your own way, essentially. But of course, it relies on the people around you still having some sort of support for you as well.
Yeah, Amjad, I know when he did take over, he sort of tried to deify himself as well. But overall, Roman culture still believed in these many gods with names that were slightly different to the Greeks. But just take us through the sort of the hierarchy and how Caesar tried to insert himself.
Well, obviously, he adopted the same model, the Hellenistic model of gods, which have been inherited and obviously described by various historians and poets, all the Greek gods have been basically Latinized. Apart from Apollo, who retains the same name both in Greek as well as in the Latin culture.
So the senior god is Jupiter?
No, senior god is Uranus,
Okay.
and the Roman equivalent is Saturn. And then, of course, we do get the Saturnalia, which was a pagan festival in the winter solstice. It was celebrated usually in December. And then, of course, that was later Christianized by the Christian fathers. They basically took over a pagan festival and tried to Christianize it by adopting and in a way that pleased the previous Roman, dominated culture, as it were, and tried to Christianize it. And that happened, of course, after Constantine the Great, and we'll come to him in a moment. But you quite rightly describe, and Arif mentioned as well, there's always been experiments between two models of government, outright ruthless dictatorship where you get your way all the time, and then, of course, reform, and, you get other people in the decision-making process, such as the Senate. And I think throughout the world we see that we get these two extremes, and they're still prevalent to this day. But again, of course, as far as the the Middle Eastern parts of the empire was concerned, particularly Palestine and so forth. We had the Jesus movement there, and of course, all ruthless dictators and emperors don't like a new king, on whether it be spiritual king or worldly king. So they regard any prophet or any new person on the scene as a threat to themselves and a threat to establish order.
I think this is probably a good place to stop, because we're really getting to the stage of and you mentioned, Arif, earlier in the introduction, of Christianity. And Palestine was always a trouble spot for the Roman Empire. The Jews expected a great reformer, a reviver, a Messiah figure who would come and free them from bondage. And obviously there are different interpretations, whether you're a Jew or whether you are the follower of Jesus Christ, who came, who was born and grew up to be a prophet from Muslim point of view, Son of God from a Christian point of view, as we will talk later on how that came to be seen. But he had a major impact on that area as a young man as he grew up. And the governor at that time, Arif, was Pontius Pilate.
Pontius Pilate.
Who's given a bad time in some of the books, but I think he was a reasonable character who tried to judge between the Jews and Jesus.
I think if you read the history, you'll see that he did actually try and find out what the issues were, and essentially wanted to wash his hands of the problem. But of course, because the Jews were very insistent and the people around were very, very insistent, it was only because of that, essentially, that Prophet Jesus was crucified. So he may go down in history as the person who condemned Jesus, but actually he was trying to go through a judicial process. He interviewed him. These days, police will interview suspects, and obviously is given a bad name because he was the person that's seen to be the person that condemned Jesus to crucifixion. But maybe history hasn't been so kind to him as it could have been.
Yeah, one of the most interesting things I always like is when Jesus was being asked all the things that, are you creating a revolution and whatever, and are you taking, Caesar's position? And his advice was, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God's. And on that point, I think it's good to have a break, and we'll carry on the discussion after the break. So welcome back. We were discussing the Roman Empire, which had a really big problem in the Middle East, in Palestine in particular, with the Jewish tribes that they were trying to control. They'd appointed a governor, Pontius Pilate, there to look after the region, and the local Jewish king at that time, Amjad, Herod was the overseer, wasn't he? He was not liked, Arif, by a lot of the Jews. I gather a shady character. Would you say?
A very brutal king, obviously, one who was very authoritarian, didn't like any dissent, and put down dissent, and didn't give any hope to people either. So yes, quite a brutal king. And obviously at that time, the Jewish people thought that they would be this great military leader who would be their salvation, who would help defeat the Romans, as well as give them some guidance. But of course, history tells us that Prophet Jesus came, a very peaceful, meek person, not the person that in fact, complete opposite of what the Jewish people were expecting. They had obviously quite a literal interpretation of the prophecies regarding Elijah, but the people that came, John the Baptist as a forerunner, and then Prophet Jesus, were obviously very peaceful people, prophets or people from God who taught peace. And this obviously only agitated the Jewish people more. And despite Jesus' best efforts, despite the disciples that he did create, he wasn't really able to flourish, or his message was not able to flourish. Although it is a very beautiful message, it was not ready. The people obviously didn't appear to be ready to accept it at that time. His mother was obviously a very blessed and peaceful person. And when she gave birth to him, she knew that he was going to be a special person. She had obviously received some insight, maybe some prophecies herself that this was going to happen. And despite as I said, his best efforts, eventually he was effectively betrayed. and handed over to Pontius Pilate.
In fact, this is an interesting story as well, isn't it? His disciples spent much time with him, heard his addresses, and it was one of his own disciples who actually betrayed to the Romans, Judas Iscariot.
Judas Iscariot. Yes, I think he was summoned originally by the temple priest, and he took some coins to inform on the Jesus movement and his disciples, which is so sad. And they caught Jesus in the garden, and then with other disciples, and allegedly, the historians tell us that St. Peter pulled out the sword to defend Jesus, and Jesus said to him, Peter, those who live by the sword shall die by the sword. And he says he was a peaceful man, just as Arif has alluded to. He did not want to fight, and he did not even resist the arrest, because he was a righteous man. He had nothing to fear. Yeah, we will know all about his trial that took in the dark, when, according to the Jewish law, it should be during the daylight hours, and he could bring his witnesses. He was not allowed to bring his witnesses, and purely on hearsay, and the church, the temple authorities, prosecuted Jesus and then handed him over to the Romans to be executed.
I mean, here in fairness, Pontius Pilate tried his best to judge fairly, and in the end, he said, I wash my hands, knowing that Jesus was probably not guilty of what they were accusing him of, but he couldn't do any more. And so, according to the gospel sources that we have and other historical data that is presented by the Western world, he was crucified and then taken down into the sepulchre, and his disciples apparently believe that, and Christian, this is where there is a big difference, isn't it?
Of course, this is where you could say, as a historical event, of course, it was much more complicated than just the trial of an ordinary person. Jesus, by no stretch of the imagination, was an ordinary person. But his crucifixion did lead to this, you can say, big split between the Jewish teachings and the Christian teachings. Christianity believing that he was taken down dead, and after 3 days he rose again. This forms one of the central planks of Christian teaching, whereas the Jewish faith has a much more simplistic view that he died an accursed death, and that he was not a prophet of God. And that obviously is where there's then this divergence between Judaism and Christianity, and of course people still have those beliefs today. And this also led on to the development of in effect, Judaism didn't develop really as a religion, but whereas Christianity was very much in its infancy. At the time, it's worth bearing in mind that the prophet Jesus didn't create or bring a new religion. He lived and died as a Jewish person, and it was only later on, something which I'm sure we'll come on to in a minute, that Christianity became a separate and distinct religion. And I suppose the reason for this is really around the teachings or the interpretation of what happened at the crucifixion, about either Jesus dying or Jesus dying and being raised again. And we see those cultures, Christian and Jewish cultures, even to this day, based upon these teachings.
I mean, obviously, from a Muslim point of view, the belief is that Jesus was a very righteous prophet and that he didn't die on the cross because, as you say, most of our traditions, generally Jewish and Muslim, believe that God doesn't allow his righteous prophets to die an accursed death. But we leave that as a separate matter. But the differences start happening between Jews and Christians around that time period. And so we have the view from the Gospels that, that Jesus ascended to heaven or whatever, and Christianity as a movement carried on. On the other hand, Amjad, the Jews continue to await this military person who would come and rescue them, and they were still agitating, and a terrible tragedy befell them, didn't it, from the Romans?
Well, absolutely. They were oppressed and subjugated people, and they had this oppressive Roman puppet as their king, Herod. He was actually raised most of the time in Rome and spent little time with the local community. But he was very ruthless, cunning. But yeah, just to allude to, in all fairness, not all the church, not all the temple authorities were against Jesus. There was one minor temple priest, Nicodemus, and he always regarded Jesus in high esteem and referred to him as a rabbi from Nazareth. So it was the Nazarene movement that the rabbi from Nazareth and the early apostles or the companions of Jesus and disciples did not believe in Jesus to be kind of Son of God at all. This came much later in Christianity. So we have the Syriac Church, which was led by St. James after the demise of Jesus, Prophet Jesus. And there's another apostle, better known as Doubting Thomas. He traveled all the way to Kerala and settled there and preached Christianity, which was basically predated the Nicene Creed.
Yeah. I mean, in many respects, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found much later on, also seem to suggest the same thing that you're saying, because they had an account of well before Jesus' arrival and after Jesus' death.
Basically,
as well.
Prophet Jesus came from the Jewish Kabbalist sect known as the Essenes, or he had great supporters, and they were also influential in his thought early in his early career, as it were, and so they played a major part, and they didn't have such concepts as God, the Son of God, and so forth. They always believed in the Abrahamic faith, that of Moses and Aaron as being one God, and and the mission of the Nabis and the prophets. So there was no room in the early Christians for the Son of God concept. Now we know from historical records that this was a Nicene Creed initiated by basically the Council of Nicene.
We're going to come to that later on, but in relation, you were talking about the disciples, and I just want to sort of touch on that one. We discussed earlier how one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, had betrayed him, and I think I'm quite right. I think he was so upset with this that he actually hung himself. And to this day, Judas Iscariot's got a pretty bad image.
And yes, unfortunately, whenever you hear the word Judas, it's usually regarding somebody who's seen to be a traitor. It becomes synonymous with somebody who is being a traitor. Whether that is the real historical, accurate portrayal of what happened, but that's what people obviously believe, and obviously that precipitated the crucifixion of Jesus, and as you mentioned earlier, the Jews totally rejecting Jesus. Now it's quite interesting as to what happened to the Jews after Jesus moved on from that area, whether he ascended to heaven or whether you believe that he went somewhere else himself. The Jews eventually continued their uprising. They were put down ruthlessly. I think it was around the 66, 70, where basically their temple was burnt, razed to the ground. I was shocked to hear about how many Jews were actually killed around that time. About between 600,000 to 1 million Jews were actually killed down. So we hear about the modern day Holocaust, but obviously this was
when you compare it to the population of that time,
relative terms, complete destruction of their community. Many, maybe about 100,000, were sold into slavery, and the rest were dispersed throughout the land, throughout Palestine. I think 1 million were also dispersed. So again, this, although it's related to, you could say, a religious incident, you can see that this will obviously have had a big impact on their culture and on their religion and their history, that they were dispersed to so many parts and so many of their people were killed as well. So yes, it did unfortunately have a very negative and bad impact on the Jewish religion and on the Jewish people, in that a lot of their culture was destroyed and a lot of their people were destroyed as well.
I mean, ultimately, though, the Christians eventually had the upper hand in terms of the faith, etc. But that took quite a bit of time, and you touched on that. But let's just sort of work this step by step. which disciple was the earliest one then to go to Rome to preach after Jesus'?
Historians tell us that it was St. Peter who went there to Rome and preached, and unfortunately was also martyred there. He was persecuted. The first 200 years of the Jesus movement, basically they were, and Jews, just as Arif has alluded to, because of the uprising and the ruthless putting down of the Jews, they were killed and dispersed and throughout the Middle East, and the Jews and the Christians were persecuted, and of course Jesus movement was also connected with that part of the world, and hence the early Christians were also persecuted, and apparently St. Peter was martyred, and he was buried subsequently in Rome.
And St. Paul also.
And St. Paul. St. Paul later on obviously converted to Christianity. He was not among the early disciples. However, he saw the vision on the road to Damascus and converted to Christianity around, Arif, is it around 70 AD?
Around 70 AD.
Yeah, 70 AD.
I think initially he was actually a persecutor of the early Christians. But again, from a historical perspective, this awakening or this vision that he had.
This is the famous
on the road to Damascus.
On the road to Damascus.
And obviously then he spent his later life really promoting the teachings of Jesus and Christianity and taking this to a much wider community, Amjad.
And I suppose there's a lot of people who say that he changed many of the original teachings. What are your own thoughts?
I think this is the founder, what we can say, of modern day Christianity is St. Paul rather than Jesus or any of the disciples, because if you look at the teachings of St. James, and they still continue, there's a significant presence of the early Christian communities in the Middle East still prevalent in Syria, known as the Syriac Church. Unfortunately, they're again persecuted, this time not the hands of the Romans, but some fanatical Wahhabi Muslims. But that's the earliest known Christian community that we have, and of course there is a strong presence of Coptic Christians in Egypt, and there is of course the Kerala Christian community, which is far predates the Pauline Christianity, because that's the St. Jude. This is the Doubting Thomas's community in India, and they still survive. And of course, there is among the various Christian communities, there's a debate to this day about the divinity of Jesus. There's always been, although the Roman Catholicism Christianity has to try to, because they're the majority and they hold sway in numbers and in money and in influence and power, so they have won the battle, as it were, as far as the divinity of Jesus. And of course this goes back to the basically the Council of the Nicene Creed. This is following the conversion of
Well, this is where absolutely the great Constantine the Great, there's a beautiful sort of explanation, isn't there, of how he came to accept Christianity and established it as a major faith. I think he was having a battle with his co-emperor. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. As you know, the Roman Empire was you had a number of competing generals to the throne. So he was battling one of the eastern
Maxim or something.
Yes, at the Malvian Bridge, he saw the vision of the cross, and that if you follow the sign, and he will become the ruler of Rome. And ultimately he did, and that vision actually inspired him to have his victory against his opponent. And then of course he converted to Christianity, and he brought the various competing sects of Christianity, as it were, together.
I think that's when he tried to say, well, look, what is the basic central theology?
Theology of Christianity, and nobody was quite sure actually. So the early, everybody argued, and I think which gospels to have, which books are to be included in the Bible and which are to be kept out. So many books.
And also the central concept of Trinity, I think.
Yes.
That was the meeting, wasn't it? The Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost.
So this really is three,
it's a very important...
Jesus never preached that, neither did the disciples. This is a concept that came in 300 years later. So this has no foundations in early Christianity, or the apostolistic period as they call it, because all the apostles were of course Jews, and they believed in one God, and they probably held the belief that Jesus was some kind of a Jewish prophet, a Nabi, and a Messiah, of course, which is a theme that the Muslims kind of have.
But from Constantine's point of view, and from many other Christians at the time, the many gods of the Romans were now replaced by a Son of God.
The Son of God,
had this Trinity simplifying things.
Yes, of course. So he kind of imposed a kind of a Roman, Greco-Roman gods onto the image of Jesus, and thus basically Romanized Christianity, and thus hence the Roman Catholicism that we have today, and the Nicene Creed.
What's quite interesting, if I may just make a comment here, is that you see that even though the message of Christianity was obviously a very good message and something that would have come from God, we as Muslims would believe that had come from God, and Christians would believe it come from God. It required almost a sort of a strong man or a person of influence to help spread Christianity, and also maybe a slight adaptation or adoption of other cultures before it widely became spread. I mean, from what I recall, the early Christians were very heavily persecuted. Most of them lived in caves. They were fearful for their lives, even though they were following the message which was given to them by Jesus. They didn't feel confident enough to go out and spread that amongst the general population. And it takes, a strong person or a ruler of a society to adopt that before it was actually able to flourish and now become the dominant religion even to this day. So it's interesting that you have that interplay. Although it's a very peaceful and tolerant religion, it needed this impetus and an adoption of other cultures before it really flourished and spread throughout the Western world.
I mean, it was a very interesting contribution, wasn't it? Because you had, on the one hand, the Jewish culture, which had become very hard-headed and very hard in its interpretation, literal interpretation of God, and many people would say a sort of a savagery towards other people, other cultures. And you also had this very dominant Roman culture as well, militaristic, very strong, very powerful. And then you have this teaching which is very soft, pliable, teaching you to develop yourself spiritually. So it's quite attractive for those who are weak and meek and looking for a powerful God to support them. And this is where you had the very interesting development, didn't you? Because over time, the Roman Empire started falling apart. And you had this debate going on that, is it because of us losing our many gods that we're losing power? And is it because of this Christian faith and whatever? And that's when St. Augustine, who was one of the most powerful or most important figures in the Christian, came onto the scene. Arif, do you want to deal with it, Amjad?
Yeah, basically, St. Augustine tried to separate the church and state in his famous... try to codify how the state should live and how the church should conduct, and he thought that the church was mainly to deal with the spiritual aspects of people's life, and didn't want to mingle. The church should stay out of temporal, day-to-day political matters. So that has been now the kind of template which has been adopted by the West, as it were, the separation of state and the church, as it was. And of course, the Roman Empire also split between the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire. And of course, the Western Empire declined. It was Rome was attacked by the Visigoths in around 400 AD, and the Vandals and so forth, and all the provinces, Britannia, Gaul, Iberia, and the various Germanic tribes took power and kicked out the Roman legions. So Rome basically was left at the mercy of these Vandals, and that was also when the church went eastwards. So Byzantium became the bedrock of Christianity, and it was, of course, centered around.
So, from the Western Christianity point of view, in the Western world, the Dark Ages followed, but it wasn't that dark in the rest of the world. There was plenty of light.
No, of course, because new empire was emerging when the two, dominant empires of the ages, the Romans and the Persians declined. The Arabs came onto the scene, and of course they were enlightened by the teachings of Prophet Mohammed, and Prophet Mohammed, just through unique experiences, he had, of course, the temporal authority as well as the spiritual authority. And just because he was fleeing persecution himself, the adopted city, they chose him to be the more noble man and made him the head of the city-state. So Muhammad became a prophet and, of course, a governor or of the city-state.
And obviously the civilization that sprang from the prophet and his teaching, we're going to deal
and, of course, again, Islam spread like a wildfire, but it was also amalgamating religion that took on ideas from India, from Egypt, from the ancient civilized Greco-Roman as well as the Persian. So they gave us a new arithmetic, which we'll talk about in the subsequent programs, and how Leonardo, a piece known as Fabiucci, he adopted the Arab-Hindu numerals, and that subsequently replaced the cumbersome Roman numerals in the West, and trigonometry, algebra, and so forth.
I suppose this then brings me to the role of the popes and papacy in the Crusades, because you have the Byzantine or Eastern Orthodox Empire, and then you've got Western Christianity and Roman Catholicism, and the popes ruling from Rome, or I suppose overseeing Christian church. And you have this new faith, new civilization springing up, taking over the Holy Lands, etc. And, crusaders being sent by the popes to go and take back the Holy Lands. Do you want to cover some of that sort of interaction period?
Yes, I mean, I think the interesting thing is that you see that obviously there was a sort of a jostling for position, that once Christianity had been established, politics always comes into religion at some point, and the popes obviously wanted to have influence. The popes are very influential even today. But at that time, it was more about seizing up land, having empires in a different sort of way, but using the legitimacy based on religion. And of course, we know what a sort of potent force religion can be. So this encouraged various popes to take and expand and spread their wings and take back land, so that those would come under their dominion or their influence. And I think that's what various popes started to do at that time, once they knew that Christianity had a firm foothold, and also a message that could be sort of adapted and be made pleasing and made appealing to people in that area.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Crusades are quite a difficult period, depending on whether you're Western Christian or whether you're a Muslim, Amjad.
Well, there is now, I think, people are trying to distance themselves from Crusades, the church as well as the Europeans, because there are stigma that they rather wash their hands off, and everybody's apologetic about Crusades because, of course, the general populace, and particularly the ruling elites, were hoodwinked primarily, as Arif alluded to, by the popes. It was Clement the First, Pope Clement, who actually basically instigated the Crusades, and initially, of course, the sentiment being behind, as Arif alluded to, was that they lost so many lands to the Muslims, to the Turks, and so forth, and hence the tax revenues, as it were, and also the route to the Holy Land, as it were, and they were heavily taxed by the Byzantium, although they thought they were representing Christianity, but they were also taxing the pilgrims onto the Holy Land. And I think we'll conclude there. And
I think this is the interesting phase of civilizations, isn't it? You start off with the teaching of Jesus, very spiritual, soft, changing people's hearts and minds. And then you have something like the Crusades, which followed on later on to the Inquisition. And then, the Reformation movement saying, we cannot take the Pope anymore and we want a separation. And these are the phases that civilizations go through. And the West has gone through lots of different phases. Complex origins, as with all cultures, but I think it's been quite a fascinating discussion, and I hope the listeners have found it a joy. In the latter part of Western civilization's history, of course, after Enlightenment, we get more influence of the Roman time coming in again. So until next time, it's goodbye from us.